Good afternoon, the 8 of you. All right, and so let me get down the names. We're doing our final assignment before test 3/final. Are there any questions or comments? All right, so what we're doing today is we're doing the alleged causes of the Civil War, okay? And because, of course, when you get into causation in history, it's argumentative, it's subjective. Different historians are going to come with different assumptions and look for different types of data to support their claims. Okay. So, what I did is I just put it into two broad categories, court history and revisionist. All right. Number one is court history, and the second section is revisionist. Okay. So, let me just briefly remind you about that. 2, 4, 6, 8. All right. With court history, right? It is it's the romanticized history that we learned as children, right? You think of a court king or queen, right, who wants to tell his or her scribe, "I want you to write a history of me and my kingdom." Well, that history is going to be selective in the facts to make that person look wonderful, justify everything that he did, make him look exceptional, etc. Right? Same thing with court history of a country. So the founding fathers, Abraham Lincoln, they're wonderful, heroic people, right? And we are an exceptional country, according to court historians. So with court history, right, with American exceptionalism, that we were born on ideas rather than just on ambition, desire for resources, thirst for power, etc. Right? But going back to the War for Independence, they contend that we had a genuine war for independence or a genuine revolution, that we were born upon enlightened ideals, right? So the social contract, consent of the governed, checks and balances. Then you have in the early 1800s to mid 1800s, liberalism, like with John Stuart Mill, the idea of just the autonomy of the individual to be the arbiter of his or her own destiny, government to stay out and maximize the degree of liberty that can and ought naturally to be exercised by the individual within that republic. Um, Constitutional government, whereby people are held in restraint of what they can do as our rulers and leaders, that they're to be our servants instead, right? And to protect our natural rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so we claim that we were born upon lofty ideals. And then, of course, right, the pursuit of happiness. I think of like Diderot and Condorcet, that the right to cultivate yourself, right, to learn, to acquire skills, right, and rise up as high socially, economically, politically as your talents and hard work can bring you. Okay, so we claim to be a land of opportunity, a land of freedom. And so, with court history of the Civil War, we contend that we fought a crusade to end slavery and to live up to the ideals that we were born upon, right? That were foundational in our origins as a country. So that's what you're looking for with number one. So what it does, right, is it first points to an anomalously idealistic generation, a generation of people that were not ordinary. They were not like the previous two generations, whereby you didn't touch the elephant in the room. You didn't touch the policy, the institution, the practice, the subject of slavery. It was a compromise, right? It was a necessary evil with the southern states, and you didn't go there. This generation will, as you'll see. They did not see the world as it is, but as it ought to be. So that hence they were truly idealistic. They wanted to improve people. They wanted to improve man. They wanted to improve society. And so they got the boat rocking, right, in a positive way. They forced the country to face and have discourse on the subject, on the morality or immorality of slavery, right? And even throwing aside constitutional ambiguity and complexities, that some of their opponents were looking into and were concerned about. Okay, so after they point to that idealistic generation, then they look to polarizing events that transpired because of the West. The Mexican-American War was from 1846 to 48, right? And in the midst of that Mexican-American War, comes the subject, like with David Wilmot, what do we do with the territories now that we're taking from Mexico? California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Colorado. What do we do with this land? Do we allow slavery in it? It opened up a can of worms. And so there will be events oftentimes tied to the West, but not always, that are going to almost make people choose a side, right? They're polarizing in their very nature. This is all court history. So then, as the boat is rocked, proverbially, by the abolitionists and the reformers of the antebellum before the Civil War period, then you have these polarizing events, and then you have the timely evolution of Abraham Lincoln. Court history depicts him, right, as kind of like character development in literature, as the protagonist who started off with many flaws, was somewhat, by his own recollection, somewhat indifferent towards slavery, because it didn't affect him. And he is going to slowly evolve toward what might be considered an approximate abolitionist, okay? And we're going to get into the abolitionists soon. So all of that, right? And then, of course, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and he was instrumental in cooperating with Congress and the Republican Party with the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery for all slaves everywhere in the country, okay? So that's court history. Revisionist, as you might guess, they want to revise, they want to challenge, they want to change that romantic image, that version, right? That narrative. And so what they do is they look at racism in the North, and you could find plenty of evidence of racism in the North. In your second section, you could find evidence of perhaps the Union, the federal government, in fighting the 11 states of the South that left the Union, that seceded and tried to form, you know what, they did form a separate country, a confederation, a confederacy. And they fought from 61 to 65, right, in our Civil War, the northern states against the southern states. And as you know, the North is going to prevail and they're going to force the South back into the Union at the end of the war. They're going to force them to give up slavery and give citizenship rights to African-American men. And then you'll have the period of Reconstruction where they try to provide the legal framework for that to happen, to integrate Black men into the Republic. It's a very fascinating topic, and I regret that we didn't have time to get into it this semester, but you should cover it in your 17B class. I know I do. So at any rate, going into this with revisionists, right, they'll find evidence of the Northern government perhaps becoming a bit Machiavellian, a bit manipulative, right? And having ulterior motives in freeing the slaves and using them as soldiers, etc., right? That they emancipated them hesitantly, that they emancipated them perhaps with a dint of desperation and manipulation, right? There's a guy named William Dunning who has a famous thesis that states that the North did what it did for slaves for all the wrong reasons, to try to break up and punish the white South. Okay, so those are the two broad categories that I have the two sections in your argumentative assignment. All right, so are there any questions before I get into some of the context, like some of the hard data of what was going on just prior to the Civil War? All right, you guys are making it easy on me. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. Okay, and I'll be happy to post this. But now we are looking at antebellum idealism. So first of all, if you look here, look at the map of the 19 northern states and the 11 southern states that were, because you don't see California in here and a couple others, right? But at any rate, you see the light green states are the Union. They're going to stay loyal to the Union and not just the Republican Party, actually. There were many Democrats known as Copperheads during the war in the North as well. And then the dark green is very interesting. Missouri and Kentucky in particular, they're going to find themselves geographically and politically and diplomatically and militarily caught in the middle of the Civil War. And you're going to have people from that are going to choose both sides. And yes, you're going to have house to house, family member to family member, neighbor to neighbor turmoil between opposing sides and loyalties and motives. So at any rate, you have the border states, and then you see there in the light tan color, that is the Confederacy. Okay, and this is a map also of the major battles. So note, most of the war was fought in the South. Okay, and the North is going to win. So moving down, okay, here's an antebellum reformer. All right, let's pretend, because I can't know, that he's an abolitionist at a lyceum. All right, which is not far, doesn't stretch the imagination too far, but of course I can't prove that with this particular picture. But you're going to have abolitionists, and what made them radical is, firstly, right, they took on the issue of slavery as a moral issue, right? That was a courageous thing to do, to impugn the motives of the planter class of slave owners in the South and to vilify them, right, as unethical tyrants. Because remember, you have to remember the Code Duello from Ireland and the British Isles, that the gentry class, remember New Albion book from David Hackett Fisher, the South was arguably colonized successfully by gentrymen. And that's a particular class, right? And to that class, right, it was kind of like the old noblesse oblige chivalry code, is they held themselves as being very classy, very hospitable, very warm, very family oriented, very loyal, and very into their family's name and dignity and reputation, etc. So if someone impugns your family name, your way of life, etc., they were almost obligated by cultural tradition to literally challenge you to a duel, which could, of course, prove fatal. And so this was a courageous thing to do, to take this on as a moral issue. Because what you could do more diplomatically is you could contend, right, that slavery was inefficient, that it was archaic as an economic institution from a bygone era that needs to be swept aside as industrialization is taking place predominantly in the northern states. For one, right, you're not giving your slaves any wages. You're not giving them any chance for advancement. So what incentive do they have to work well, to work efficiently, besides fear of the lash, of the whip? So at any rate, you could take that argument and other type of economic arguments as such, right? That we're going to remain a colonial economy if we had just that we need to become in Hamiltonian fashion self-sufficient and produce our own finished products, especially as consumerism was taking place and there was a great demand for finished products, right? And so you could take an economic stance that was a lot less controversial, but not the abolitionist. The abolitionist also got around the constitutional issues. Firstly, right, we are a constitutional federal republic. So constitution is supposed to be the ultimate lay of the land, right? The ultimate authority, the ultimate source of that authority is we, the people, obviously, popular sovereignty and consent. But here we are beholden to the Constitution. What does the Constitution state? Well, it implicitly allows slavery, right? It has a fugitive slave clause. It has a motion of a gag rule where the slave trade cannot even be interrupted until 1808, a 20-year gag rule. You have the enumeration of taxes and how many reps you are to have for every 30,000 civilians in the House of Reps. It states that it's not, you count 3/5 of all other persons, right, held under contract. And of course, that was a euphemism for slaves. And so you have that issue to contend with. The federal part, right, is that the central government has some powers like a unitary government, and the states and localities have their own powers and concurrent powers like a confederacy. And you won't find anything in Article 1, Section 8 given to Congress and that enumerated power list, anything about slavery. You won't find it in Articles 2 or 3 with the executive or the judiciary. So hence, right, there's nothing explicitly stated in the Constitution that states that the federal government can end slavery where it's already established in a sovereign state like Alabama or Virginia. So what some abolitionists did is they got around that and they said, well, let's look at precedent, right? Past precedent. In the Northwest ordinances, Thomas Jefferson and the leaders of the Articles of Confederation had decided that it would be prohibited to have slaves in the Ohio Valley territory whenever they were now at that time, and also when they would become states, that slavery would not be an option. So some of them held on to that, like Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Giddings, and they contended that, okay, that precedent has been set. So because technically the states taken by from Mexico initially, right, because California was a state by 1850, but the territories taken from Mexico, the territories not yet having achieved statehood status in the Louisiana Purchase, right? And remember, that was much bigger than the state of Louisiana. I showed you a map earlier. It's a huge swath of several future states. That because they are not yet in state status, that the federal government has the right and even the obligation to prohibit slavery in those territories as they're trying to become states. And then some, like William Lloyd Garrison, went even further and pretty much said, the heck with the Constitution. They made a deal with the devil regarding the unethical practice of slavery. And we need to just disregard and just set the Constitution aside and decide that it will not be permitted. And then you had people in the middle, like Stephen Douglas, who, not to be confused with Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist runaway slave. Stephen Douglas, a white Democrat, who contended, let's let the territories themselves decide, the inhabitants therein, by way of through their elected reps, if they want slavery or not. Okay, so the abolitionists, they were radical in taking on slavery as a moral issue. They were radical in contending that the federal government had the right and even obligation to prohibit it from spreading anywhere else into the West. Okay. So moving on to here, what they try to do is they try to provide, let me see if I have a map of the West. I thought I had. Yeah, so you see there, Kansas territory, look at all the Nebraska territory, Utah territory, New Mexico, Oregon territory, Minnesota territory. So see that all of that, they would contend they should prohibit slavery in all of those future states. Okay. So moving on with court history, is they try to first convey the fact that this generation, this antebellum generation of the 1830s through 1850s, was not normal. They were anomalous, and they were anomalously idealistic in trying to improve the world. So you had Romanticism, right, as an intellectual, philosophical, artistic, musical movement from Europe. It spread here to the States. I think of like, Edgar Allan Poe, etc. Right? They, it was a kind of a contrary movement to the Enlightenment. Coleridge had said that I, for my part, declare the world to be no mere machine. Because remember, the Enlightenment made everything in a deistic fashion, like a mechanized clock that operated by natural laws, and everything could be almost mathematically computed, even happiness. And so with the Romantic movement, they were into intuition, emotion, feeling, the irrational, the macabre, etc. And so one thing that they were against was tradition. They were for moving in a new direction, right? And the Transcendentalists here in the United States, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau are the most famous. They wanted people to transcend. I think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They wanted them to transcend their animal instincts and their base materialistic lifestyle of just living like robots, working 8 hours a day, and buying their inanimate objects and tending their own garden, right, with their own family life, etc. They wanted them to look for something deeper than that. I think of like the existentialists and the beatniks later on in the 1950s. Um, they wanted people to discern their own version, their own definition of what their meaning of life is, right? I kind of half jokingly call them intellectual hippies. They thought that if you commune with nature, that's where the essence of things, because they were a bit pantheistic, right? That like, there's like a great spirit that holds everything cohesively together, and that where if you go where that great spirit is least contaminated by things artificial and man-made, that you'll have almost a mystical epiphany on what your meaning of life is, what your purpose is, etc. And they wanted people to transcend and to cultivate themselves, to become the best people, human beings that they could possibly be. They wanted you to intellectually always pursue knowledge. They wanted you to meditate and really uh, think about everything that you take for granted, right? Like Socrates. And don't take any of your societal traditional assumptions for granted, but challenge and question everything, right? And come to your own conclusions. And they wanted you to be the best you can morally, ethically, right? And also socioeconomically, and to be able to do what you want for a living, have complete autonomy over your own life, and that is as a human being. So that's going to include Black Americans as well. So it stands to reason that from that, right, it shouldn't surprise you that many of the transcendentalists were well-known abolitionists, believing that slaves, right, because a lot of them, some of them, like Henry David Thoreau, even flirted with anarchism, that there should be no coercive institutions that tell you how to live and how not to live, etc., and inhibit your autonomy, even including government. And so, yeah, so you have evidence of quite a, perhaps arguably an anomalous generation with an anomalous anti-institutional countercultural culture of their own, kind of zeitgeist of their own age, the spirit of their age. So let's see here. You have benevolent societies that were largely held by women. People were concerned because of changes that were going on at this time. So you see here, I have urbanization. The big cities like Philadelphia, Boston, New York just mushroomed in size and population at this time, and began the beginnings of mill factory production, right? With the beginnings of like interchangeable parts and mass production and factory work, etc. Samuel Slater and all that in the New England states, especially. So at any rate, you have these changes that are going on, and then you have people historians borrow from psychology, sociology, right? That people are kind of inherently averse to change, and they want to seek some type of foundational, new, kind of an anchor in their lives, right? Amidst all this flux in their life, they want answers, etc. And so hence you're going to have a lot of religious movements at this time, utopian movements. Remember, utopia literally means no place because it's too good to be true, where they try to form perfect societies. Look up New Harmony, Oneida, Brook Farm. Very fascinating subjects of these people trying to literally do away with strife, do away with crime, trying to perfect people. And they try to put it into almost ironically with the Enlightenment, a mathematical equation. So many hours a week, with intellectual cultivation, so many hours a week with manual labor, so many hours a week with altruistic or charitable acts, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very fascinating subject in and of itself. They challenged assumptions like with education, and contended that there needs to be a public education outside of New England, that's nationwide. And there needs to be basic education even for young girls. And of course, some argued for assimilated, quote, Negroes and assimilated Native Americans. So Horace Mann, M-A-N-N, was the superintendent of education in Massachusetts, and his kind of paradigm was copied in several states. And so that became a big issue with public education, believe it or not, as controversial as uncontroversial as it seems now as a bygone just axiom that we all accept. Um, you have uh, prison reform, the idea that inmates ought to be rehabilitated, not just punished, right? So a lot of prison reform was going on at that time. The asylum movement for those with psychological ailments, like Dorothea Dix, DIX, a very interesting subject in and of itself. They were called, for that time period, the lexicon was acceptable, insane asylums. And so just a lot of reforms going on. People were concerned about the breakup of the nuclear family as the main economic abode kind of changed from the home to outside the home. And so people were worried about the breakup of the husband, wife, and kids. They were worried about prostitution, alcoholism, domestic abuse, the kids leaving too early and choosing their own spouses. Yes, that was even an issue because from the colonial period, it was, I don't know if I would even say it was the norm. It kind of was, but people, normative behavior is broken and defied all the time. But it was kind of normative behavior for the parents to have a strong hand in whom their sons and daughters would marry. And so that was largely challenged at this time. And so lots of changes, lots of reforms going on. And then you have practical issues, right? Crime, sewage and waste disposal, fires, right? The problem with increasingly ubiquitous poverty. All of that's going on, and there were a lot of fraternal and civic organizations in the 1830s, especially that arose to try to tackle these issues, what they perceived to be modern problems. Okay, and then you had the Great Awakenings. I say plural because it was pretty multifaceted. Some people call it the Great Awakening, but it was largely evangelical Christian, and it defied Calvinism, right? The idea that some people are meant or destined to go to heaven and some are destined to go to hell. Those destined for heaven were destined to be forgiven by Christ, and others weren't. They opted, of course, for Arminianism. Arminianism is that you have a choice. Every human being has a choice. God wants everyone to go to heaven, and it's up to that person. And so, but also just the idea of human perfectionism, right? They thought that Christians in particular could literally begin to live eventually a sinless life. And so that kind of optimism spread well beyond evangelical circles, where people, like I said, with utopian movements, became very optimistic about how wonderfully well people could live, how much better society could become. So with all of these things, right, it's used as a backdrop for court history of the Civil War, that this is an anomalously idealistic generation. They're not taking tradition and authority at face value. They're challenging and questioning everything. They're wanting to improve and change, right? And so hence they're going to take on slavery as an issue. So the abolitionists, right? Firstly, right, those who were for moral suasion, right? Moral suasion, right? That inherently politics requires too much compromise. So therefore, some of the abolitionists stayed clear of politics and wanted to just morally persuade Americans to stop the institution, stop the practice, right? And so you had the spoken and written word. You had lyceums, and lyceums were intellectual fairs that were open to everyone who would pay a small fee, and they would get to see a myriad of so-called experts give lectures on a myriad of fields, and including, of course, abolitionists who spoke against slavery. Some of them, like the Grimke sisters who had run away from the South, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, Frederick Douglass, who had run away as a Maryland slave, had some very, very sentimental stories, right? Stories that would really literally move their audience to tears. Douglass, for instance, right, had stories about his mom being spitefully sold away from his mother, and his mom sneaking and coming to see him and crying and holding him and singing to him the whole time. And then suddenly she ceased to show up. the story of a simple-minded, big, strong slave that he felt intellectually responsible for, said he had the mental development of a child. And there was a misunderstanding when they were told to bathe in the water. He didn't get out of the water, and the overseer shot and killed him right in front of Frederick Douglass. And his brain matter and blood went on Frederick Douglass's shirt, and Frederick Douglass refused to change his shirt, wanted to remind everyone what that overseer had done. And so you had some very, very dramatic stories. So hence the lyceums and those types of institutions and practices, they gave a disproportionate voice to this small number of abolitionists. Okay, the argument goes. And then, of course, you had the cylindrical rotary press, and that helped enable the establishment of the penny press, of mass production of newspapers, and along with, with the public school programs that were burgeoning in many states, that gave a big reading republic, right? To have access to these newspapers, these affordable penny newspapers, and to read what the abolitionists had to say. And then, of course, along with the printing press, you had Uncle Tom's Cabin, for instance, right? The sentimental novels of that time period. And with Uncle Tom, right, he's a Christ-like figure. He takes the blame for a rebellion that he had tried to keep down himself and had nothing to do with. And he himself is punished in their stead. And he forgives his overseer, as his overseer literally is killing him at the end of the book. There's an anecdote, I don't know on its veracity or not, but there's an anecdote where it could be apocryphal, but where supposedly Abraham Lincoln met her, shook her hand, and said, "So you're the little lady who started this war." Such was the importance, supposedly, of that book. So the public, right, they're being stirred by the abolitionists. They're definitely rocking the boat. Then, of course, there were abolitionists who went beyond moral suasion and tried to bring about the abolition of slavery through the political process and system. And they were known as radical Republicans, not just Republicans as a new party in 1854, first running a presidential candidate, but as radicals within that wing, within that tent party. So you have Benjamin Wade, Wendell Phillips, George Julian, Charles Sumner, Salmon Chase, just to name a few, okay? And so with Salmon Chase, he started a program where he began to collaborate with Southern politicians who were anti-planter class. They're Southern whites, but they were against what they saw to be the oligarchic, parasitical rule of the planter class in their own states, and they wanted to challenge it. Salmon Chase of the North, as a radical Republican, teamed up with such people like Cassius Clay of Kentucky, and tried to get white voters to move over to the Republican Party, and basically stated that those jobs out in the fields should be going to you as sharecroppers, not to slaves. That slavery hurts you just as it hurts the slaves, and it hurts the South as a whole. And so to the Southerners, right, this is like fomenting class war in their own states. So the radical Republicans are really making waves in politics. Some of them also refused to vote with just basic middle moderate line Republican policies, because the Republicans were also for Hamilton's system, right? Of the government subsidizing commercialization with trade, urbanization, right? Industrialization, helping out businesses that they thought were good for America, railroads, etc. And so they would refuse to vote in party line if others did not move further to the left with them, and at least try to vote in, for instance, like executive governors, right, who were abolitionists, who would then have a lot of patronage power in giving out hundreds or even thousands of positions within their states once they became governors, and that they were told to only give positions to abolitionists or to at least anti-slave politicians. Okay. So you have all that going on. You had like Lewis and Arthur Tappan and the Tappan brothers, like wealthy abolitionists who just flooded the South with literature, lots of literature going down into the South and trying to shame the white South about slavery. So notice, right, these types of practices. You had Charles Sumner use his great articulation skills and sarcasm and irony to just lambast the Southern planters in the Senate. And so hence you get the picture right here with court history. And remember, they're being selective with their facts. That this is an out of the ordinary generation, idealistic, courageous, confrontational, and they're really rocking the boat. All right. And then, of course, you had polarizing events in the 1850s. So you have, here's just a list. It's not an exhaustive list. Okay. The Compromise of 1850, they had California became a free state, but then they had a strong fugitive slave law, runaway slave law, whereby northern states had to hand over runaway slaves. And you had a system like between different institutions, even government institutions in Virginia and New York City, for instance. There's a book called The Kidnapping Club, a relatively new book that's very interesting on this topic. But at any rate, whereby they began kidnapping African American children and adults and selling them back to these southern states, sometimes with no proof at all that such people had been slaves. There was a young boy named Henry Scott who got a lot of publicity because he was not a runaway slave. And they tried to get him, they literally abducted him from his school in New York City as a young black kid. And so that was polarizing. A few states in the North issued liberty laws saying they would not abide by it because the idea, right, is it brought slavery right to their eyes in the North. It's easy to kind of tend your own garden and live your own private life, right, when it's not in front of your face. But like in your 17B class, when you have the civil rights movement and you have Birmingham footage pop up on your television, suddenly it comes to life, right? How awful racial discrimination and violence are. So at any rate, you have that. You have the Kansas and Nebraska Act of 1853 and 54, and whereby they decided that the state legislators or the elected reps at the state conventions at Kansas would decide if they wanted slavery or not. Both sides contended in electing their reps to the convention that the other side had cheated. And both sides claimed to have their own cities in Kansas and claimed that they were the legitimate government. One obviously prohibiting slavery, the other alleged government claiming that slavery was to be sanctioned. And so it literally devolved into a civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. And so this was polarizing, right, to people. It was almost making them choose a side on this issue. You have the Underground Railroad, the 19, trips made by Harriet Tubman and freeing over 100 people. But she was just the tip of the iceberg for this railroad, which it wasn't a railroad and it wasn't underground, right? But it was an intricate system of collaborators trying to get runaway slaves from the South up into the North. And remember, a slave, right, according to historian Gary Nash, an antebellum slave was the equivalent in the 1990s to like $30,000. So that's an expensive investment of, quote, chattel property that is being, quote, stolen in light of the Fifth Amendment that states that the federal government is to recognize and protect American citizens' life, liberty, and property. Okay. So at any rate, another one that I have that I'm mentioning with the evolution of Lincoln is the Dred Scott case, right? Dred Scott, his owner dies after moving him up into northern free soil. He sues for his freedom, and the widowed mother and her brother are going to claim him. And it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to contend that no black man has any rights to sue in court, period, and that it is the obligation of the federal government by way of the Fifth Amendment to protect people's property, right? Their chattel property, which formerly, right, under English common law, going back to Rome, was the categorization of a slave. So hence, right, if you have a tractor or a horse, and you move from Georgia to Michigan, it's still your tractor or horse when you're in Michigan. And so but saying, right, that it's the obligation of the federal government to protect their property anywhere they go, in any northern free state and any Western territory. That is going to be extremely frightening to the abolitionists. And so that was clearly polarizing, and it brought some people from the moderate middle further to the left, along with the abolitionists, and being concerned about such a radical decision on behalf of the South. Charles Sumner was almost caned to death for his caustic tongue by Preston Brooks in the Senate floor. John Brown tried to initiate a slave rebellion with only 19 men at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Took over a federal arsenal, tried to spread out, disseminate the weapons, and of course it didn't work. He was tried, had a big, huge trial, and was executed. So these, right, were events that were seen as polarizing. They were almost making people choose a side. And then the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Remember, that's the white Douglas Democrat. Douglas said, let Kansas decide for itself if they want slavery or not. Lincoln said, slavery is immoral. We do not have a democracy, but a republic. It should not be rendered to the popular vote or referendum or to even elected reps in the states to decide for themselves, but that the federal government has the right, and that he, if he won the Senate position, would opt for the Congress prohibiting slavery from going anywhere into the West, even if every inhabitant of the West theoretically wanted slavery. So hence he became known as the tyrant in the South, who on his own would unilaterally prohibit slavery from going into the West, regardless of what the people themselves wanted. Okay, so he's elected in 1860. So 7 states immediately, and 11 states eventually claim to have left the Union and formed the Confederacy. Then with Lincoln, right, you see evidence of an evolution with him. By his own, announcement, he was indifferent to slavery as a child. His parents took a stand against it in Indiana when he was a kid, but he claims he was still rather indifferent to it. But he had an abolitionist preacher that he listened to for years, and it eventually began to sink in. He also had 2 episodes on the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers where he saw slaves for the first time, and it disrupted his eating and sleeping, he contended, and really gnawed at his conscience. And he also bunked with Joshua Giddings in Congress, and Joshua Giddings constantly was kind of whispering in his ear things abolitionist. All right. And he's going to get some of his ideas from Giddings, such as the founding fathers intended slavery to eventually die out, and they would have approved of prohibiting it from spreading anywhere further into the West. Okay. So let's see here. And then throughout the course of the war, by the time he was killed, his final speech, he gave the encouragement to Louisiana at his state's convention to give citizenship rights to some of the, quote, better sort of the Negro men. And supposedly John Wilkes Booth said, voting or suffrage for N-words, that man just gave his last speech. And of course, within hours, he would kill him, or he would shoot him, and Lincoln would live on for a little bit and eventually die from his wound. So at any rate, his Emancipation Proclamation, right? He declared the slaves of rebels to be freed, but not the slaves of those who fought with him. Okay, remember that. But in the 13th Amendment, which he supported, that declared all slaves free. Okay. I'll be happy to post this. So the Browning's resolutions. Okay. So revisionist history in the next section, it challenges this. It says, okay, look at the 19 Yankee states. How many of them gave citizenship rights to some African-American men? 5. Minnesota, Ohio, they had referendums to let their people vote on citizenship for, quote, Negroes. Both of them failed. Yikes, right? And this happened even during Reconstruction, while they were forcing citizenship on the South. So that's some hypocrisy, right? The draft riots, they not only were rebelling against the draft, they not only were rebelling against the rich who could pay a fee to have someone fight in their stead, but they also attacked African Americans and contended, "We will not die for the N-words," was chanted. The Browning's resolutions contended that the abolitionists in Illinois would not be allowed First Amendment rights because they were agitators, they were troublemakers, they were stirring up trouble. So hence they would not have freedom of expression in the state of Illinois. And granted, Lincoln was amongst only 6 state legislators, assemblymen, that voted against it. All right. You got to remember the Ohio Valley, for instance, at the end of the War of 1812, there was a land grab in the Ohio Valley, and a lot of Southerners took that opportunity to move up into Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, right? Moved up into there to get cheap, affordable, fertile land. So hence, right, the argument, you could take the Southerner out of the South, but you can't take the South out of the Southerner. This is only the second generation of Southerners, in some cases, first generation, those who went young. And so you had plenty of xenophobia in the North, right? A hateful fear of outsiders, of whatever was not considered WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. All right. Look at the Free Soilers. They were against slavery, right? But for all the wrong reasons. They wanted those jobs to be given to white men, not, quote, Negroes. They thought slavery was archaic and inefficient, as I've already mentioned. So they were not doing it out of humanitarian reasons. Look at the Know Nothing Party and how many candidates won election in northern states. And their platform itself was xenophobic. They were anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-African American, anti-Native American, anti-Hispanic, anti-Irish. Look at the popularity of Copperhead Democrats, who contended that this war was unnecessary. The abolitionists dragged us into it. We need to come to terms with the South and let them keep their slaves. Look at how worried Lincoln was of winning re-election, or hence of losing re-election, to a Copperhead Democrat candidate. And that's just in the North, because the South left Congress during the Civil War. The Crittenden Resolution stated at the beginning of the war, we are not fighting to end slavery, but we're fighting to make the South come back into the Union. Then, in addition to evidence of racism, revisionists look for evidence of complexity, right? That it was not just a cut and dry romantic crusade story. So first of all, right, the idea of dividing and conquering. George Julian, a radical Republican, right, senator, he had given a few speeches in the Senate trying to appeal to the humanitarianism of the senators. It didn't seem to work. So he gives another speech where he says, guys, I tried that avenue to no avail. Now I'm going to appeal to your self-interest. If we don't use the slaves, if we don't free them and give them an incentive to run away from their Southern masters and join our army and fight for us, the South is going to make them fight against us. And it could mean the difference in winning or losing this war. Because you have to remember how precarious the Civil War was. It was kind of like a Rocky movie. The North lost most of the major battles early on in the war, in this 4-year war. So he contended we need, right, to divide the South and to use the slaves as soldiers before they do. Ulysses Grant has a quote about the psychological damage that using and freeing slaves would do to the South, that they would shake in their boots, that it would have a divide and conquer effect on the white South. Because every slave, right, while he's being used as a slave to dig latrines, cook food, bury the dead for the army, or stay at the plantation and do work on the cotton plantations. Now he has the incentive to run away once he hears the Union Army is near and join the Union Army. And Lincoln likewise has similar quotes. The Confiscation Acts issued early in the war basically referred to slaves as chattel property and stated, right, that on a technicality, that because at first, you guys, the North refused to recognize the South as a separate belligerent nation, but they wanted to treat this as an domestic rebellion, right? But it didn't work because they wanted to exchange prisoners of war, and the South wouldn't do it unless they were recognized as a separate country. And they wouldn't even promise to protect Union or Yankee prisoners of war if they didn't. So Lincoln succumbed, and he acquiesced and said, okay, fine, you're a separate nation for now. But this was before that, initially, with the first Confiscation Act. And they stated that, okay, if you're a rebel, you're technically a rebel and fighting against us. So if we defeat you, we claim the right to confiscate your property, which includes your slaves. And you look at people like Benjamin Butler here. He freed slaves when he won battles, and he basically enslaved them for the Northern Army and treated them like dirt. His name was Benjamin Butler, and he was far from the only one to do such in that type of manner. Look at the 54th Regiment. If you've seen an old movie from the 90s, I'm dating myself here, but a wonderful movie called Glory with Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, Matthew Broderick. True story, right? At least loosely based as such, on the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts, one of the first, quote, colored regiments of Black soldiers. Look at all of the discrimination they faced on behalf of their own army, their own society. And it's sad. Lower pay. They had to fight under white leaders, captains, and so forth. They were not trusted to go where the fighting was the fiercest at first because they didn't trust them with guns and their loyalty. And then the border states, right? The border states, Kentucky, there was a tongue-in-cheek joke that Lincoln once said. He said, I'd love to have God on my side, but I need Kentucky. Contended, right, that you look at Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson. It's a good book on the Civil War. He opens up one called The Dilemma of the Border States, and he gives stats that are pretty sobering of how many men, how much materiel was found in those border states. So hence they could have made the difference in tipping the scale for the North or the South, depending on what side they chose to fight with. So Lincoln, right, contends to one of his abolitionist radical Republican members that he chose to put in his cabinet, William Seward. He tells Seward, when Seward threatened on more than one occasion to quit and resign from the office because he didn't like what Lincoln was doing, Lincoln tells him, listen, he issues a chess analogy, okay? He states, firstly, I have to know how to play my pieces, right? Firstly, he said, even in the North, I have to almost pretend to be indifferent about slavery. If I appear to be anything approximating an abolitionist, I won't win re-election. He says, look at the abolitionist candidates, John C. Fremont, you yourself, William Seward, right? Look how badly you lost for the presidency. The North is just not ready for that. So he says, secondly, I have to win the war or it's all a moot point. And I need the border states for now. So I'm cutting them a deal. They can keep their slaves for now if they fight with and for me, right? So that's what he does. And then he says, when I can operate from a moment of strength and I no longer need the border states, then I will free the slaves. The border state reps just don't know it yet. And he has a famous third letter to the diplomats representing Kentucky. He tells them, guys, this is your last offer. I'm not going to offer it again. I really appreciate your loyalty and fighting with me. But as you can see, I'm in a diminished state of dependence upon you. I don't need you as badly anymore. The tide of the war has changed, has turned, and we seem to be winning. So I'm going to offer you a deal that I'm not offering the rest of the South. I will grant you gradual compensated emancipation. So put a demarcation at a certain years of age. Oftentimes it was like 30 years old. And I can't recall, I apologize, if it's above that age or below that age, remain slaves. And then the other group is bought by the federal government at market price. And then after that generation dies out, or if it's those younger than 30, after they get up to 30, they're no longer slaves either. And there are no future generations of it. So hence gradual compensated emancipation. They didn't take it. And so he treated them no differently from the rest of the South and just confiscated their slaves. But that's known as this chess analogy. All right. So to Howard Zinn and other revisionist historians, they don't buy that. And they think that when he issued it in January, that was right at the time of Antietam. And yes, it was it could technically be considered a Union victory, Antietam, because it was a Southern invasion of Maryland. And remember, Maryland is a border state, and that's where the federal capital was, caught between the North and South. And the Southern Army retreated back to Virginia. But the losses were so great. And yeah, I mean, you could just make the argument that really, how much of a victory really was that? And you look at Chancellorsville, the battles of Bull Run, so many big battles that the North lost. And Howard Zinn and other historians contend, no, he was still feeling very vulnerable when he freed the slaves. So hence he thought it would be useful to divide and conquer the South. And also when he issued his Emancipation Proclamation, he made it more clear for the first time that the North was at least partially fighting to end slavery, right? And the Confederacy had a lot of diplomatic and military ties to Great Britain in particular, whereby it seemed possible at certain given junctures that England might side and make an alliance with the Confederacy. The whole just, the just keep your rival divided and weak for no other reason. But now abolitionist sentiment, they were more progressive in England. The fight against the slave trade and slavery, etc., it was stronger in England. And so hence he knew England would be less inclined to ally herself with a country that was no longer just saying that we're fighting for states' rights, for the federal government to stay out of the issue of slavery, out of the territories and out of the states, and let the people decide for themselves. Because hence having a confederacy, right? They were libertarian in their rhetoric, anti-big government, anti-big brother. But now it would seem more like they're fighting for the Confederacy that is fighting to keep their slaves. And it seemed to work. England drew back after the Emancipation Proclamation. Did someone have a comment or question? So the faction thesis, revisionist historians contend, right, is that the Yankees were not against the spreading of slavery on ethical grounds. Maybe the abolitionists, but the abolitionists were like 2.5% of the population, they say. But they were against it because they wanted factional allies in the West, say revisionists. Remember, a faction, as stated by James Madison in the Federalist Papers, is a group that shares the same political platform, the same worldview, and or the same economic interests as you. So hence, right, he contends that most people, that it's inherent in human nature, that they're going to vote for what's best for their own faction that they identify with. So hence, right, I don't need to win over if something is good for adjunct instructors at community colleges, right, in Modesto, California, and it's also good for someone in Newark, New Jersey, and they had some type of federal legislation enhancing the union power or whatever of adjunct instructors. I don't need to win over those gentlemen in Newark, New Jersey. I don't need to meet them. I could count on the fact that what's good for me is good for them, and we're likely going to vote the same way. So hence, that's the faction thesis, is that the planters of the South and the bourgeois people of the city of the North, they wanted factional allies in the West. So hence, they wanted they wanted, fellow bourgeois people in the West as allies for the future in Congress. And the Southerners wanted allies like in New Mexico, where they said that cotton would grow well in the West for power. Because remember, in those new states in the West, they get 2 senators no matter what, and 1 House rep for every 30,000 civilians. So you get numbers of allies, and numbers rule in Congress, right? A simple majority in both houses can pass a law. So something to think about. Are there any questions? Any questions at all? All right. Can I get a couple thumbs up? You guys with me? Are we good? Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Kirthana. Good, good. Bella, Ali, thank you. And Adeep, good, good, good. All right, you guys have been great. Like I said, I've mentioned before, because you are on a tighter schedule, I'm especially proud of you guys in getting these done every 4 to 5 days instead of every 7. And so this constitutes your last assignment, guys. And so we'll have one more Zoom meeting probably on Monday at noon to cover the 3rd test, and that will constitute everything. That'll be it. So you guys will get your points today. And just know that, like I said, I'm proud of you. I wish I could have met you guys in person. And that's all I have for today. Thank you. Thank you, guys. All right. You guys have a good week. Have a good day. Take care.